Putin's troubles are mounting at breakneck speed. That's the message from former CIA Chief of Russian Operations Steve Hall. And what comes next might break the Russian dictator. Today, we'll explore Steve Hall's predictions for what will happen in Ukraine and see if Putin is truly doomed. It's almost impossible to turn on the news nowadays and not hear more reports about Ukraine asking for additional ammunition. Recently, a sensationalist story about Ukraine running out of air defense missiles had many believing that the end was nigh, and the Russian Air Force would finally show up and rain destruction from the skies, ending all Ukrainian resistance. However, the truth was that Ukraine was simply stating that at the current rate of consumption, they would be running out of missiles in a matter of months, not immediately. Likewise, Ukraine has famously been running into supply shortages of shells for its artillery as well as other more specialized kit like GMLRS rockets for its HIMARS. But what might surprise you is that Russia is having the exact same problems, if not worse. Russia's ammunition problems are becoming just as acute as Ukraine's, but unlike Ukraine, Russia doesn't have the advantage of a global coalition of allies and partners willing to shoulder the burden of resupplying it. Russia's global coalition instead consists of Iran, reportedly South Africa, and China on the down low. The advantage that Russia has had over Ukraine, however, was a massive stockpile from the Cold War when everyone was hoarding ammo in anticipation of Armageddon. But that stockpile is running dangerously low. A few months ago, Ukraine announced that for the first time since the start of the war, it had achieved artillery parity with Russia on occasion. Typically, Russia fired 20 times the shells Ukraine fired back, but ammo shortages brought the two to a more even playing field. HIMARS strikes and Special Forces sabotage behind enemy lines helped exacerbate Russia's ammo problems, bringing the average exchange rate to 6-to-1. This dramatic drop in artillery had a direct effect on Russia's ability to conduct offensive operations because Russia has a garbage army that relies on blasting everything in front of it to oblivion from far away before moving their garbage army forward to take ground. Unsurprisingly, when Russia is no longer able to deliver overwhelming amounts of artillery at long range and its ground forces have to actually fight, the results aren't very pretty. But that's to be expected of an army that undergoes very little real training and is mostly made up of conscripts, with the few professional soldiers it does have more interested in corruption and lining their own pockets than actually soldiering. Russia's largest gains in the time after Ukraine's fall offensive were at the hands of the Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin's private army that Putin contracted out to fight in Ukraine. Unlike the rest of the Russian military, Wagner is better equipped and better trained, but their best war-winning strategy was the use of prisoners recruited from Russian detention centers who were promised their freedom if they survived a term of fighting in Ukraine. Neither Prigozhin nor Putin had any intention of allowing the majority of these prisoners back into society after being incarcerated, and thus Prigozhin used them in human wave attacks that were very successful in Bakhmut. Under threat of being shot if they retreated, Wagner unleashed hundreds of armed prisoners to assault blindly into Ukrainian positions. Once the Ukrainians opened up and thus revealed their defenses, Wagner's regular non-prisoner forces would mount direct assaults. The tactic was brilliantly effective if, like most Russians, you have little to no regard for human life other than your own. Ukraine was steadily pushed back under the sheer weight of the manpower the Russians were willing to sacrifice, only to then use well-trained and equipped forces to assault where the weak points emerged or were discovered. It's not entirely unlike Russia's strategy during the great sieges of cities during World War II. Wagner's successes were not just fueled by the sacrifice of prisoners, though, as it was heavily reliant on the Russian Ministry of Defense for supplies and equipment. While Wagner has over the years purchased a significant amount of its own equipment, including attack helicopters and artillery, inside of Ukraine the group has been extremely reliant on the Russian military for resupply. And this has been Prigozhin's Achilles heel, and might end up costing Russia the battle for Bakhmut after 10 months of fighting. And it all comes down to the way Russia does politics. Well, Putin specifically. Like any good dictator, Putin ensures that none of his underlings are too successful, as that might draw people under their banner. If that were to happen, then that underling might gain enough political capital and popular support to usurp Putin's throne, or this being Russia, just straight up murder him. Thus, Putin ensures that his government is constantly at odds with itself, with advisors and those who hold senior positions in his government and military all actively working against each other. This is where Prigozhin enters the chat, because the man once known as Putin's chef has seen a meteoric rise to become one of Putin's bestest and goodest of good boys. Despite private military companies being against the law in Russia, Putin has allowed Prigozhin to fund the establishment of Wagner under one condition: It would, in all but name, serve as an extension of Putin's, not Russia's, power. Thus, Wagner Group intervened all over Africa, and the Middle East, greatly expanding Russian influence and enriching Russian businesses while committing a laundry list of atrocities and human rights abuses that would rival the Russian military's own. Wagner's successes quickly shot Prigozhin up the ranks of Putin's personal goodest and bestest boys, until eventually Prigozhin was one of the very goodest and very bestest of all his boys. And that didn't sit well with Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, because a man with Prigozhin's ambitions and military successes who also owned his own private army wouldn't be content being Minister of Agriculture or silly walks. Prigozhin was gunning for Shoigu's job, and Shoigu was doing a bad job of showing why he should get to keep it. Under his leadership, the Russian military had become the #1 supplier of military aid to Ukraine as it broke and ran time and time again. And we're not kidding about this. While the West has pledged around 100 tanks, Russia has abandoned an estimated 500 to be captured by Ukraine. That's on top of sophisticated air defense systems, vast amounts of ammunition, and a whole lot of very expired rations. To say that this was a real bad look for Shoigu is an understatement, and many have wondered why Putin has fired multiple Russian generals, but never his top goodest military boy. The truth may be that Putin keeps Shoigu in charge of the military because without Putin, Shoigu is nothing. Like Prigozhin, Shoigu is a complete outsider to Russian power politics, having ascended the ranks and coming from a nothing background. This means Shoigu has very few allies in the halls of Russian power, and thus cannot be a threat to Putin. But Shoigu is most certainly feeling the heat, as Prigozhin put the Russian military on blast over and over again over its failures, even while touting the victories of the Wagner Group. It would be easy to replace one man that Kremlin elitists don't particularly care for with a completely different one, and still remain secure knowing whoever's running his military would never have the political capital to challenge him. Eventually, Shoigu struck back. First, he took credit for Soledar, a salt mining town in eastern Ukraine that by all accounts Wagner did most of the fighting for. An angered Prigozhin took to social media to refute the Ministry of Defense claims that it had been the Russian army who took the town. But Shoigu wasn't done, and just as Wagner was on the eve of its greatest success in Bakhmut, with only 2 kilometers left to take the entirety of the town, Shoigu pulled the plug of supplies. Now Russia has been having legitimate supply issues, which Ukraine has tried to alleviate by donating multiple volleys of HIMARS rockets directly to Russian supply depots. But by all accounts, Shoigu has purposefully manipulated supply chains to keep Wagner on a very tight leash in Bakhmut, and then at the start of May yanked the leash hard enough to keep Wagner from succeeding. Prigozhin responded by taking to social media to rant like a 14-year-old who just lost a ranked Call of Duty match. He threatened to pull Wagner forces out of Bakhmut altogether and hand them over to the Russian military, which would have been a massive disaster and thrown the door wide open for Ukraine to launch a devastating counterattack. Shoigu and the Ministry of Defense claimed that they were not manipulating supplies on purpose and that Wagner was receiving everything it was allotted. Then, Prigozhin upped the stakes by declaring his forces would pull out of Bakhmut on May 10th. Suddenly, the supplies started flowing again and Prigozhin recanted. However, just 2 days later, Prigozhin was once more complaining his forces were being denied supplies. So, was Shoigu really preventing Wagner from winning in Bakhmut? Or are Russia's supply problems that severe? First, Russia's supply problems are definitely that severe. Russian guns, which used to fire nearly around the clock, are now silent for long stretches of time. Ukrainian frontline forces have had significantly more breathing room, as evidenced by recent assaults across the Dnipro River in the Kherson region and elsewhere. Operations that would have been met with immediate disaster due to overwhelming Russian firepower. But Shoigu is without a doubt making a play in Bakhmut to cut Prigozhin's knees out from under him, or at least he tried to. Wagner has been responsible for the main assault on Bakhmut itself, while its flanks were secured by the Russian army. The Russian army on the city's flanks have been attempting to cut off Bakhmut for months now with the goal of reaching the 2 major supply routes going in and out of Ukrainian positions. As Wagner drew closer to its complete capture of the city and Ukrainian forces were pushed further to the outskirts, the flank attacks increased in tempo, with up to 53 attacks in one day reported across one stretch of highway. The fighting raged even as Wagner ran out of ammo, making it clear that Shoigu was hoping the Russian army could close the encirclement and claim victory while Wagner was forced to sit on its hands for a lack of ammunition. But Ukraine got a say in all of this and it chose violence. While the initial flank attacks were successful, Ukraine's emergency deployment of special forces held in reserve for the spring offensive stopped the Russian army's offensive and then started to push them back. With Wagner unable to launch attacks against Ukraine's center, it freed up manpower to reinforce the flanks and began to assault in a counterattack that continues to this day. In fact, Prigozhin has recently taken to social media once more to berate the Russian forces, which have been slowly but steadily ceding ground to Ukrainian attacks, and potentially leaving Wagner's flanks completely exposed. Prigozhin's latest attacks against the Russian military have bordered on outright sedition. He's claimed that the Russian army forces have broken and ran at first contact with the Ukrainians, and states that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is in full swing. However, Ukrainian soldiers on the ground confirmed to CNN in an interview that the forces which were cutting and running were actually Wagner troops, while Russian regular army units were holding their ground until they were defeated. And as far as the coming counterattack, there's no sign yet that Ukraine has launched its full offensive, with actions around Bakhmut being part of the regular ebb and flow of the ongoing 10-month battle. Prigozhin didn't stop there though, as in an incredibly rare event he seemed to lash out directly at Putin. In one of his broadcasts, Prigozhin appeared to vent frustration aimed squarely at Putin. As his troops once more ran out of ammunition and the Bakhmut flanks came under attack, Prigozhin stated, "And the happy grandfather thinks that he is good. If he turns out to be right, then may God grant everyone health. But what will the country do, our children, grandchildren who are the future of Russia? And how can we win this war if, by chance, and I'm just speculating here, it turns out that this grandfather is a complete shithead?" Putin is frequently referred to as the grandfather by the Russian military and political leadership, and Prigozhin's statement seems to be taking aim directly at Putin in what would be the most public and radical critique of Putin by any senior official. Prigozhin was quick to walk the comment back when interviewed by the press, giving multiple figures in the Russian Ministry of Defense whom he states could be the grandfather he was referring to, while never mentioning Putin. However, in all likelihood, this is a sign of even Prigozhin's growing frustrations, which he is in turn now venting directly into the Russian military leadership. And this is one of Putin's biggest headaches, though it is doubtful if he ever sees it as such. With Shoigu and Prigozhin actively sabotaging each other, the Russian offensive in Bakhmut is coming apart at the seams right when it's at the cusp of complete victory. A victory which we'll have to remind you is completely worthless, as Bakhmut is utterly strategically unimportant, save as an ideological win for Russia. The Bakhmut trauma is playing out all over the war effort though, as different factions within the Russian army all vie to undermine each other and secure their own glory and political wins. This chaos is by Putin's own design though, as he works to ensure that no one faction from Chechnya to Wagner to the Russian military becomes powerful enough to challenge him directly. Even as Russians die by the droves because of it, Putin's own future is assured. Now Putin's troubles have increased once more, and it's for once not because of its own forces. Ukraine has been begging for long-range precision weapons since the war began, but the West has steadfastly refused. It took months to get HIMARS to Ukraine, given the ability to target several dozen miles behind the front lines. But Russia responded by simply moving its command posts and supply depots further back and out of range. This had an immediate impact on its ability to operate, but did not completely disrupt its efforts the way long-range precision weapons would. Since then, the US has categorically declined to supply Ukraine with ATACMS, which would triple the range of the HIMARS Gimler's rockets and could threaten Russian targets all the way to Crimea. The US might be right in its denial, as ATACMS might be very high in demand in case of war in the Pacific against China. But after over a year of waiting, the UK has once more taken the lead and provided Ukraine with the Storm Shadow cruise missile. Originally developed in the 90s, the Storm Shadow missile has a degree of stealth much like the US's long-range anti-ship missile. This makes it a significant problem for Russian air defenses, and with a range of over double the HIMARS, Ukraine will finally have the tool it needs to strike at sensitive Russian targets deep behind the front. The Storm Shadow missile can be fired from either the ground or from the air, where it'll achieve its maximum range. It's not known if the missile is compatible with Ukraine's Soviet planes, but the UK expressed confidence that Ukraine would be able to make the quote full use of the missile. It's also unknown just how many of the missiles the UK has donated, though the UK Defense Minister Ben Wallace assured that at least some Storm Shadows are already inside Ukraine, with more on the way. With over 900 of the missiles in its inventory, the UK has plenty to spare, especially as it's now seeking to modernize the Storm Shadow and field a new, more capable variant. This means that there is a pressing need to get rid of the existing stockpile, so Ukraine might find itself with hundreds of Storm Shadow missiles if UK rearmament efforts produce a more capable evolution and begins to mass produce it. Ukraine has promised not to strike inside the Russian Federation itself, because while Russia is allowed to strike Ukrainian targets with impunity, nobody in the West wants to risk giving Putin a frowny face. Once more, Putin's crazy rants about nuclear weapons are paying dividends, as the West collectively browns its pants in anticipation of the imaginary nuclear Armageddon Putin might unleash if military bases in Russia start blowing up. In response, Ukraine has been establishing its own long-range cruise missile program, literally from backyard workshops across the country. The fact of the matter is that Ukraine can't hope to win this war without striking at the Russian bases supplying the war effort. And until it does, even if it beats Russian forces all the way back to its borders, Russia will simply launch long-range attacks into Ukraine while massing for a fresh assault. But Putin's final headache is coming from within. On May 3rd, 2 drones were apparently used to launch an attack on the Kremlin. One was intercepted, with Russia claiming it also intercepted the second, which instead simply appeared to detonate an explosive charge next to the Kremlin's flagpole. Russia immediately blamed Ukraine, which categorically denied the attack. According to Russian sources, the drone attack was an attempt to assassinate Vladimir Putin directly, which, if true, would mean that Ukraine came a lot closer to decapitating Russia's leadership than the dozens of Spetsnaz Russia deployed at the start of the war to kill Zelensky. However, the drone's tiny explosive charge would have been unlikely to kill Putin unless he coincidentally chose that night to climb to the roof of the Kremlin to recreate his favorite scene from King Kong. The blame then shifted to the US, which Russia claimed had given the order for Ukraine to attack the Kremlin with drones. However, as one commentator noted, if the US had been behind the attack, the Kremlin would be a crater. Also, it simply doesn't even make sense, as the US had been reluctant to provide any long-range weapons to Ukraine exactly because of its fear that Ukraine would use them to launch attacks into Russia. Putin's nuclear saber-rattling worked. Everyone in the West has the Hershey squirts at the thought of the, quote, escalation. It's utterly unthinkable, then, that the US would simply give the green light for Ukraine to assassinate a flagpole. Instead, many now believe that the drone attack represents an internal threat, and a real one this time. Putin is most likely the master of false flag attacks, although in truth he's simply borrowing his favorite tactic from the Russian playbook, because Russians have no problem killing other Russians to advance political goals. A false flag attack on their own border guards preempted the invasion of Finland in World War II, and Putin coordinated a series of false flag terrorist attacks to legitimize himself as president and launch a hilariously disastrous invasion of Chechnya, where Russian tank forces got their teeth kicked in by a bunch of rebels with exactly 0 tanks. But the attack on the Kremlin just might be the real deal, and the call may be coming from inside the house. Since the war began, Russian military recruiting officers have had a bad habit of spontaneously catching fire. As the war dragged on, it was now warehouses, shopping malls, railroad tracks, and even fuel facilities that were now going up in flames or exploding. Without a doubt, a number of these have been the work of Ukrainian sabotage operatives, as they followed almost to the letter old Soviet sabotage doctrine that would have been put into effect in case of a war against NATO. Russia has apparently forgotten that Ukraine was once part of the Soviet Union, and while it forgot its Cold War training, Ukraine apparently did not. However, a growing Russian resistance movement has been gaining steam, even as hundreds of thousands of men are drafted and sent to war. On January 3rd and 4th, partisan attacks on railroads halted the movement of men and supplies along the Trans-Siberian Rail Network, all going to Ukraine. This would be the 6th case in just the first few days of the new year of partisan activity. In the prior year, multiple locomotives were destroyed, and there were 40 confirmed cases of sabotage of Russian rail infrastructure. The fact that this activity increased significantly after the announcement of Putin's partial mobilization implies heavily that this is a true Russian partisan movement and not more Ukrainian sabotage. Currently, the resistance movement is tiny, but the number of attacks seem to be increasing over time. This could turn into a massive headache for Putin, especially as many now state that Russia cannot win in Ukraine without a full mobilization. But Putin has likely taken the temperature inside of Russia itself and knows that a general mobilization could be the final straw that breaks the camel's back. Russians love themselves a good old dictator, but Putin broke the social contract upheld in Russia for decades. You can be the dictator all you want to be, as long as you don't actively make life worse for Russian citizens. Now go check out what would happen if Russia and NATO went to war day by day, or click this other video instead.